say this, Professor Friedman, I really thought, when originally, before I ever met you and heard your arguments, that because you're a Nobel Prize winner, you really were something special. I have to say, you haven't even reached A-level economics in this country. I have to be quite blunt about it.
Well, that says something very bad about A-level economics in this country.
I find it very difficult, really, to argue with Professor Friedman because he's advocating essentially a religion. And like all religions, he has a sort of divine presence, in this case the hidden hand and so forth, and he has the wicked principle, and the wicked principle being governments. And by sort of balancing one off against the other, he can really turn the argument any way he likes.
Japan is a very successful country. Germany is a very successful country. Another country where the government has had very strong policies. Or modern France is another case. Or Sweden. All of them are ones where the government has succeeded visibly. And it's not enough for you to say the government in a few places has made major mistakes. Therefore, the government is terrible. Because I can provide all these other examples where governments have been very effective.
I think we're all being too polite because I see why Professor Friedman has become a world figure. He doesn't allow anyone else to get a word in edgeways. He ploughs on with unsupported assertions which have really got a very tenuous connection. Just here and there, you can just see the tentacle reaching down to a bit of fact.
Well, where are the support? Would you give me a supported assertion, sir?
There must be government intervention, and the condition of the British people has fundamentally changed, despite all our problems. Our people live at a totally different level now, and that could have only been done because of government intervention. So I don't accept your premise at all. I think it's a totally false premise.
I put it to you that the three, I suppose, greatest economic miracles of the last 100 years in the Industrial Revolution in the United States at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, same thing in Germany at the same time, and in Japan since 1948, took place behind very high protectionist walls. So what evidence do you have that freedom of imports contributes to growth and employment?
Friedman, your argument is that free trade is always good.
Let me start by saying that I am not in favor of the freedom of business to export and import, but of the freedom of people to buy goods and sell wherever it is cheapest and to sell their products wherever they can get the highest price. Business has no interest. Business is an intermediary between people in their capacity as workers and producers, as investors, and in their capacity as consumers. So the freedom I am interested in is the freedom of individual people. Now, if we look at the history of various episodes as you have done, you've left out some very important ones. You left out the experience of Japan from 1867 to 1897, which was discussed in the film, a period immediately after the Meiji Restoration when they had complete free trade. They were prohibited by law, by an agreement with Britain, from having a tariff of more than 5%. They had many imports of textiles that destroyed in large measure their hand-loom weaving industry. But the result of a free market was that people were better off both as producers and as consumers. They are better off as producers because you cannot export without importing. To say that you should export and not import is a prescription for denuding a country of its wealth, for transferring it to other people. Exports are the cost that you incur in order to get imports. If you get imports, if you get cheap imports, that benefits people as consumers, but it also benefits them as producers by providing them with raw materials to work with, to exercise their skills on, to use their capital on. The consequence is a higher level of living for everybody in the country. You also left out, I might say, Hong Kong, which has had complete free trade, has had a tremendous rise in the standard of life of its people. Here's a barren rock in which the population has multiplied tenfold since the end of the war, and per capita real income, allowing for price changes, has gone up about fourfold. So there are many examples, I believe, of the great virtue of free trade for both people in their capacity, both as consumers and as workers.
You use an extraordinary line of argument because what you say is you say, well, people have made mistakes in the past, governments have made mistakes, therefore government intervention is wrong. And the point is that you can get all kinds of examples, as, for example, in Germany, Brazil today, Japan, where in fact governments have been very effective at fostering the development of modern industries. Now, if they were as incompetent, as useless as you say, this would never have happened. In fact, if you look at the Japanese economy, to go back to it, as many big, efficient companies, almost all of those companies were founded by the government. They were provided money by the government, they were provided special privileges, and they've had those privileges to this day.
The formula of both of these gentlemen is a formula for the impoverishment of Britain, and particularly for an attack on the consumer. This is the most anti-consumer measure you can take. is a measure to limit imports and protect inefficient industries. I don't know where. Maybe the textile industry should have been destroyed. Maybe it's not an area in which you have a comparative advantage. If it should, there would be some other industry that would develop in which you would have a comparative advantage abroad. Look at the situation in the United States, where I know better. What's our major export industry? It's agriculture. Not because of any protection. It has never been protected very much. If you look at the history of Britain, when Britain developed the textile industry in the 19th century, there were no tariff walls. Here was Japan. Had no tariff walls at that time at all, and yet it was able to develop an effective textile industry.
Destroyed the textile industry of India, of course. We had all our manufacturing processes and so forth, and destroyed, just as you say, the Japanese industry.
But again, are you going to tell me that no industry, every vested interest must be protected, that you must have no change? In the American steel industry, there is no doubt that the protection from imports has had the effect of causing them to be slow in introducing new techniques, has had the effect of having essentially agreements with labor, which has meant overstaffing. There is no doubt in my mind that if in the United States we threw the steel industry open to the winds of competition, you would end up with a somewhat smaller steel industry, but a much more efficient one.
You see, Professor Friedman, your argument is that free trade is always good. Now, it's quite clear that there are some countries in the world that have done very well on the basis of free trade. That's undeniable. But your film, for example, rests entirely on the example of Japan. And in actual fact, the Japanese economy for the last 100 years has been either a very highly protected economy or else it has had an extremely large degree of government intervention in industry.
That is not correct.
Yes, it was true. In the 19th century, there was free trade in the 19th century, which, by the way, was not chosen by the Japanese leaders, as you say. It was forced upon them at gunpoint by the United States in 1854, followed by Britain and France. They did not choose it. They resented free trade very bitterly, Japanese leaders. They fought a long agitational battle against it, and when they were strong enough, by the end of the 19th century, they went over to protection. And through the whole of the 20th century, Japanese industry has been highly protected. And the modern industries of Japan we know today, electronics, engineering, for example, were all developed on the basis of very strong government intervention and very strong protection. And yet in your film, you give no other serious example other than Japan. And as far as I can see, that is an extraordinarily incompetent performance in the sense that you do not discuss in any way how Japanese industry developed. You just imply throughout the film that it was based upon completely free trade and free enterprise.
In the 19th century, in the 30 years after the Meiji Restoration, there were some government involvement primarily in sending people abroad to be trained, primarily also in the steel industry and the Navy, shipbuilding, for military purposes. That was costly to Japan and did not benefit Japan. You have the other examples. We gave in the earlier film the example of Hong Kong. We have given the example of Britain in the 19th century. But in any event, let me go back to your point. I find this a very amusing situation in one respect. 25 years or so ago, when I was in Britain, I was arguing with the people at Oxford at that time mostly, and they were arguing that there was a structural dollar shortage, that the United States was a strong country that everybody else had to protect themselves against. And now we have the argument coming from Cambridge, I guess it shifts from Oxford to Cambridge, exactly the opposite, that there's a structural dollar surplus, or that Britain has a structural pound shortage, that Japan is somehow structurally to be feared. But let's look at the situation of Japan just in the past few years. Japan has shifted from a large balance of payment surplus on current account to a large balance of payment deficit on current account because of the changes in exchange rates and the effect which that had. The real fallacy in all of your arguments is not to take account of the indirect effects. If you restrict imports here, you restrict exports there. If you save jobs here, you lose jobs there. And you save jobs that are less productive, you lose jobs that are more productive.
Professor Friedman, are you seriously arguing that countries like Japan and Germany, for example, Japan in the 20th century, when it protected its major industries to build up a modern industrial base, or Germany in the 19th century, or may I say the United States in the 19th century, or Brazil in the last 20 years? Are you saying that these policies were completely useless?
Yes.
Because of
course that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that those countries would have been far better off.
Yes, but
if they had provided... Let me go back to the American
wait a
case.
minute, but you provide... The interesting thing about this is you provide no evidence of this whatsoever other than assertion, and in your film, for example, you relied on example. You didn't rely upon argument, you relied upon example. You kept on referring to Japan. And what I'm saying is that Japan is a bad example, and in fact you can point to many other countries that have developed on the basis, very successful on the basis of very strong government intervention into industry and very strong import controls. And the point is that since those countries have succeeded, it seems to me that what you're doing is asserting, as in fact Lord Kearton said, a religious view. You're saying things would have been much better if they hadn't done it on the basis of no evidence. There's been no major country...
Excuse me, the logical argument was fully developed by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations 200 years ago.
Adam Smith was relating to a situation when we had an industrial revolution. He was really relating to a position when we had a village blacksmiths about the largest enterprise and so forth. And this idea that each chap following his own private interests, essentially of single artisans working for themselves, is applicable to the modern world is just not so.
His basic principles are applicable. You know, the funny thing about this kind of an interchange is that what you want to do is to go back to the period before Adam Smith, when you had a mercantilist society.
You keep on adducing to us extreme views. The fact that I am not 100% free trader under all conditions doesn't mean to say I'm absolutely all for import control in a massive sense. What I'm saying is, in a very complex situation which different countries find themselves at different times, you've got to have some overall management of the economy. And the idea you can leave it to the so-called invisible hand just seems to me a bit of the higher nonsense.
Well, all that I can say is that wherever you've had overall management of the economy, in the extreme case, it's been a disaster. The most extreme cases, of course, are cases that fortunately we're not faced with here, the totalitarian countries like Russia, China, etc. Well, nobody would say that kind of overall management has been successful. If we take the case of Britain, let's take the case of Britain. You've had overall management for the past 20 or 30 years. Britain is not exactly in a state of prosperity.
Listening to the arguments, and listening particularly to your arguments about the position of Britain in the last century and so on, one would get the impression that the mass of ordinary people did very well in that society. They didn't. A few people at the top did very well. The mass of ordinary people, many of them lived in abject poverty, had to struggle in order to find a job. They had no sort of support in any way. And it was only when the state began to intervene did the ordinary people of this country begin to live decently, and even before the Second World War. We can take you to areas of Britain where there was misery, mass misery under the free enterprise system, to such an extent that one of our Tory Prime Ministers, Harold Macmillan, actually wrote a book called The Middle Way, in which he looked at where he represented and said, we have to have government intervention in order to help us out of that sort of thing, which was never happen again.
In the first place, your description of the 19th century is wrong. There has in the past several decades been a reconsideration by economic historians of the experience of the 19th century. And what that has shown is that what happened during the Industrial Revolution was to take people out of agricultural areas where poverty is invisible and bring them into industrial and urban areas where poverty exists and is visible. There is no doubt that there was a great deal of poverty and difficulty and misery. The question is whether conditions were improving or not. During the whole of the 19th century, both in the United States and in Great Britain, there was a very great improvement in the lot of the ordinary person and not merely those people at the top, as evidenced by everything that was happening to population, to health standards, and the like. The thing is that what happens during a period like that is that poverty, the exceptions, the areas which have been held back, the bad things that happen, because of course always things are mixed, there are some bad and good, become much more visible. Dickens could not have written his novels 100 years earlier because what he would have been describing would not have seemed exceptional. But in the 19th century he could write his novels. If we take America during the 19th century, the evidence for the improvement in the lot of the people is the way they voted with their feet. We had millions of people, my own parents, who came from Europe and flooded into the United States. They didn't flood into the United States to be exploited. They flooded into the United States because their lot and a lot of people like them was being improved a great deal.
May I interrupt you?
Pogroms as well, which have had some
The point,
effect.
Professor Friedman, is not, you see, whether capitalism has not brought benefits to the world. There's no doubt whatsoever that it has done. There's no doubt whatsoever that in the 19th century the position of the mass of the people improved as a result of capitalist enterprise. I think there's no doubt about that. The point about it is whether their condition also improved, for example, because of things like trade unions or government intervention. Absolutely. The point is that many of the things you point to, like public health improvements, were not just because the standard of living was higher due to capitalism. It's the fact is there was public legislation on it. For example, many of the improvements that took place in the 19th century in Britain followed things like legislation over maximum working day, over things like working conditions and so on. And you can't say those are all the result of free enterprise, because in fact they were struggles to force the government to intervene against free enterprise.
Look, in the first place, let's be clear about one thing. I am not an anarchist. I believe there is a very important role for government to play. The question that we're talking about here is whether that role includes import controls, tariffs, central planning, decisions about which activity, which area industry should move. Again, I want to emphasize that the interest I have is in the well-being of the ordinary person. And I think there's a great misconception about free enterprise and about capitalism. There's a misconception which regards it as oblivious to the problems of the disadvantaged. If we go to the 19th century again, it was the greatest period of eleemosynary activity in the history of the world.